Welcome to the NAFA webinar, Ethics for Insurance and Financial Professionals, Questions for Consideration and Discussion. I am Brendan Burnett, NAFA's Director of Professional Development, and with me today is Robin Mueller. It's my privilege to welcome Robin to the webinar. He entered the insurance business in 1979. He has been an agent in field management and in home office, and he's a past president of both NAFA Milwaukee and NAFA Wisconsin. He is a Distinguished Service Award recipient of each of those associations, and for 3 years, Robin served as president of the Foundation for Insurance and Financial Education. He's authored 2 of NAFA's programs in a box, one on multi-line transitioning and the other on ethics, of course, the topic that we're going to be speaking about today. He's a frequent presenter at both NAFA meetings, and he's also spoken at GAMA, NAFIC, and MDRT. His university inducted him into their athletic wall of fame. And currently, Robin travels America. He is a professional motivational speaker and entertainer. And he often speaks on Social Security, retirement, and taxation, how financial products work in terms of Social Security, multi-line transitioning, and including segmenting a book of business into approachable markets, cash value life insurance and life insurance fact-finding, annuities, and ethics and suitability. Those are all among the most requested topics for Robin to speak about. And he's also hosted presentations on sales ideas, motivation and speech, and presentation techniques. Now, it's very important today that this webinar be as interactive as possible. We'd like you to give your input, ask questions, and provide answers to some of the questions that Robin's going to raise. He's going to raise many of them around the topic of ethics. And so in order to do that, please enter your questions and comments in the chat box or the question box throughout the presentation, and I will be addressing those questions out loud for Robin to answer, and also providing your feedback to Robin. And if you have any general questions, we're going to have a Q&A session during the last 10 minutes of the webinar. So with that, Robin, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, Brendan, thank you, and welcome in for those of you that are on this ethics webinar. For those of you that might be driving, be safe. For those of you doing some other work right now during this ethics session, getting CE credit, that wouldn't be ethical, would it? So, ethics, I've been studying it now for over 20 years, and it always begs the question when individuals attend a live session for 3 hours or 4 hours, or they connect on a webinar such as this. How do I make you more ethical? And the short answer to that is, I can't. I believe you're either grounded or you're not. I believe you're either ethical or you're not. For me, it's like that word sincerity. When you really think of sincerity, if you are a sincere person and you have it, you can't hide it. If you don't have it, you can fake it for the short run, but not the long run. Eventually, your true self surfaces. And that's just as it is with an unethical agent. Very, very tough for someone who's ethical. And I'm going to just go out and say that all of us, hopefully, that are on this webinar are ethical people. Very difficult for us to compete in the short run with an unethical agent. In other words, someone who would say and do anything to get the sale. Certainly, I believe in the long run, an ethical agent will always win out over someone who's unethical, but in the short run, it might be difficult. So the goal then of this brief 1-hour webinar is to make you think. And in the end, if I can make you think of something that a little differently, maybe something you haven't thought of as it relates to ethics, then it was time well spent. You heard Brendan say this in his opening remarks. And by the way, Brendan, I got a strip that that Wall of Fame thing out of there. I mean, it is accurate, but that's a long time ago. But I appreciate you bringing it up. The success of this webinar, ladies and gentlemen, is your participation. I like doing these sessions live. I'm seeing about 58 participants on this, and I know that through the chat session or the question and answer, hopefully you can get with Brendan, and he's going to stop and interrupt me, and so we can get the feedback going. Because to me, it's the success of this hour is the 58 of you listening, Brendan and I, the 60 of us being able to interact on some of the questions that you're seeing there. And there are a couple of them, even with my study of this subject, while I'm drawn to a conclusion, I'm not really certain I can answer. So before we get into these questions, those of you that are looking at them, perhaps you can just jot down a couple of your answers to those. But I want to bring you as current as I am on this subject. For those of you that get the Insurance News Net publication, Insurance News Net periodical, the Life and Annuities and Health Benefits and Financial magazine, April 2019, you would already know this, but on the front is suitability being pushed aside. Interesting. Is suitability being pushed aside? Talk about timely. And those of you that have listened to my program in a box with NAFA, we actually drilled down on suitability for about an hour of that 3-hour program. And I've continued to develop that. I've been studying suitability for the last 5 years. So if someone listening would have asked me, Robin, what is suitability to you 5 years ago, I would have said matching product, person, right product, right person. Right person, right product. And while I wasn't wrong with that definition, I certainly wasn't as right as it ought to have been. And as I begin to study the suitability piece of ethics, it's really not matching the product to the person to the product, is it? You really match the solution or the product to the need. And so when we take just a moment and think of suitability, as timely as it is, and it's always there, passion without suitability could be dangerous. Passion without suitability could be dangerous. And if you do believe that statement, then we have to define what suitability is. And while there are a lot of adjectives, I believe the best one I've ever found is the word matching. Suitability, matching. But what are we matching? Remember what I said 5 years ago, person to product, product to person, right product to person. Not wrong, but not as right as it ought to be. And so it's really matching the solution to the need for the person at the time. If you believe people's needs change, which they do, we always have to put that trailer on, right? Matching solution to the need for the person at that time. And hopefully that's a takeaway for some of you. If you've not heard that before, matching solution to the need for the person at the time. In a 1-hour webinar, we don't have time to get into the 17 steps of suitability, but I think if you walk away with that sentence, matching solution to the need for the person at the time, you're going to be fine. Now, I only bring that up a little off what we wanted to do today because to me, it's as timely as it gets. And perhaps some of you are aware of what's going on in Congress. And if you're not, I'll bring you up to speed. About 3 weeks ago, there are some people in Congress now that have floated the thought that they want to change the meaning of confidential. And so for a moment, I just want you all listening to think of what that means to you. If you had to define or describe confidential in one word, what would it be? And as I've taken this now around the country in the brief 3 weeks that this has been out there, I've gotten a good number of adjectives, but the one that seems to surface the most is the word private. That the meaning of confidential for most of us means private. And what some in Congress now have thought they want to change it to is that it's now public as long as it means you or does you no harm. That changing the meaning of the definition of confidential can now go public as long as it doesn't mean any harm to you. And so stay tuned. When we get into question number 2, whose best interests? That really takes us back to the definition of fiduciary. Some of you may know this, some of you may not, but back in 2010, the United States Supreme Court believed the word fiduciary was poorly defined. So they put it back to others, and obviously we know what the Department of Labor came out saying fiduciary's best interests. More about that later. The reason why I wanted to bring that up is back to the word confidential. If Congress takes this to the Supreme Court, and they may not, but if they do, it'd be interesting to see how the Supreme Court defines the word confidential, or if in fact a bill is put forward and something passed to change that word confidential to public as long as it does you no harm. So stay tuned. It may fall flat, but I want you to know it's been talked about several weeks ago in Congress. It begs the question for me, from my vantage point, is who will be the gatekeeper on defining if it would mean any of you listening harm or not. In other words, what you might define as harmful to yourself, someone else might not. And if it's the gatekeeper that might not, look out, right? So I'm just trying to get you cutting edge with a couple things that are going on right now, and we could blend it all into the word ethics and things like that. So the program in a box talks really about 3 things. We define what good ethics is. We talk a little bit about why most commissioners in every state now mandate an ethics class, and then we get into defining what good ethics is, and then the second hour is really talking about suitability, and then the third hour is getting into demographics and things like that. And so I love participation. I hope that's what you bring to the table in communicating through Brendan, and Brendan to be able to ask questions. Truth is, if we don't get through all these questions, what a great problem to have. When I do these sessions live, believe it or not, these questions you're looking at take 3 hours. It'll take me about 20 minutes to preface the questions, and then to speak to them briefly, and then have each individual do some work on them, and then break into small groups, and then we large group discussion them. Obviously, in this forum here, it runs a little bit differently, but if we really look, there's 2 of these questions I don't believe, again, I can answer fully. I think I've been drawn to a conclusion in my experience, but the very first one is ethics black and white. And there's some trailers to that, and I want you to think about this. And then feel free to communicate through Brandon and Brendan to be able to, all of us to speak to this. Is ethics black and white? And for those of you, it's not as easy as a quick no or a quick yes. For some of you, it'll be a yes. For most of you, it may be a no. But if you answer to me, if you answer, well, yeah, it is black and white, my follow-up question is, who wrote the book? And if you say, no, it's not black and white, my question to you is, should it be? You see, this is interesting stuff to me. I'm going to take you a little further on this and hope we can get some dialogue. And if not, then I'll just continue on. But I would pose that question, is ethics black and white? And I'd have some individuals raise their hands in a live session and say, well, absolutely. And I would come back to them and say, okay, who wrote the book? And I'm thinking of this one person in particular, and I'm not trying to start anything here on this webinar, but so be patient. I'm just quoting what someone said. As they said, well, the book's already been written. And I said, and what book is that? And an individual said, well, it's the Bible. And so for me, in my role today and in my role in a live class, I have to get above that. And my response back to this individual was, I understand where you're coming from, and perhaps that's what runs your life, but in the worldview, Christians are a minority. And so suddenly it comes back to, okay, is it black and white? And if so, then who wrote the book? And my experience has been a lot of people will come right back to say, okay, if it's not, should it be? What code do we run by if it's not? And this is great. I could ask Brendan this. I could ask any of you this. What might be right for you may not be right for me. And I'm looking now and seeing 58 participants. And think about this. If we were in a live session right now, I could go every one of you and say, what's right for you may not be right for me. Correct. And most of us would come away saying, that is correct. And so now we have 58, 59, 60 different, definitions of, is ethics black and white? Is it gray? Do we have situational ethics? And so, Brendan, I'm seeing some things come up, so I think this is great. I'm seeing them shoot up on my screen, and I know you're taking them, so whenever you feel we need to speak to this, it's great. But allow me this, and then we can field some of these questions that are coming up. This is awesome. Most would say ethics is not black and white, it's gray, based on what may be right for me may not be right for you. Okay? Now, that begs the question now of situational ethics, and how do we define ethics? How do we define good ethics? Okay? Because ethics could be bad. Whenever I ask for ethical stories, most of the stories I get lean negative, which is interesting because I never ask for bad ethical stories. Just give me ethical stories. Most of them lean negative, so if there's bad ethics, there has to be something out there called good ethics. Most would say one of the components of good ethics is abiding by the laws. Don't have to like the law, but if you don't abide by it, you get caught breaking the law, there may be some repercussions. Some would say you have to abide by rules. Some of you are calling in, listing from different states. Your states probably have continuing ed. That's probably why you're on the webinar today. Interesting to note that most states that have CE have an ethical requirement. And if you don't think rules are important to follow, I might recommend that you don't get your ethics requirement when it's needed and see what happens to your license. So, is part of good ethics following rules and following laws? And if you believe that to be the premise, then we have to go right back to the first question. Is ethics black and white? If you don't think it is, then we have situational ethics. Where do we get that from? Now it's gray, and we get it from values and morals. And if you bring morals into the equation of ethics, clearly we have differing definitions of it, because where do we get our morals from and our values? From our upbringing, which is all over the board, right? Loving parents, or a loving parent, or we didn't have loving parents, or family, exclusive of parents, or school, great teachers. Some teachers care a lot, some could care less. The streets, where do we get that value system? Where do we get our morals? And so I'll start this out by asking this question, and then maybe we get some feedback, and from here we go. In regards to this ethics black and white, I would make a statement that I believe child abuse is always wrong. I believe child abuse is always wrong. And now it begs the question, I pause there for a second, because I might define child abuse differently than someone listening. See, there it is. Heidi, what is abuse then? Well, you're right. Okay, how do we define abuse? And so when I'm doing a live session, and thank you, Heidi, for that, when I'm doing a live session, I'm thinking this one's a no-brainer as it relates to his ethics black and white. I believe child abuse is always wrong. And then someone says, well, Robin, how do you define abuse? And some would say abuse could be spanking. Some would be a tap. okay, to get a child's attention. Others would be spanking, as long as you don't leave a mark. Others would say, look, it's my child. I'll discipline him any way I want. And then obviously, you know, you can take it much, much further than what we're talking about here with real child abuse and things like that. So, you know, for something I thought would be as simple as, yeah, is child abuse always wrong? And people would say, yes, it's really not quite that way. So maybe it's not black and white. So let me give you another one. Situational ethics, right? Here we go. I'll make the statement. I believe stealing is always wrong, period. I don't think there's any gray on that at all. I believe stealing is wrong. Now, we would hope all of us listening would know what stealing means, all right? And if we could go under that premise, that taking something that's not ours, taking that and not reimbursing someone for it, theft, stealing is always wrong. And I've had some people in live sessions, I would go up to them, because I don't have the benefit of knowing all the names that are on here, okay? But to me, I'd go up to individuals in a live session and you know, they'd raise their hand and say, you know, I'd ask them, would you ever steal? No. Would you steal for yourself? No. And then they'd pause, and this is almost a quote. If my children were starving, I'd steal for them. Fascinating, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely fascinating. So that 98, 99% of the time, some people believe stealing is wrong. Unless their children are starving. And now it's okay. And now we're back to situational ethics. Which begs the question, remember, we're still on that very first one, is ethics black and white? And some would say, most would say, no, that it's not black and white. And now we have 58, 59, 60 different definitions of ethics, situational ethics, and things like that. So to me, it's fascinating. I've come to a conclusion. I don't want to share that conclusion yet. Brendan, is it appropriate to speak to some of the questions that have come in on this particular question?
Absolutely, please do.
I haven't seen them, so I'm going to ask you, you know, they flash in and then they go away really quick.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and summarize some of them very interesting perspectives from many of our attendees. David says that ethics is black and white for the most part. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That is clearly a distinct definition that has lasted throughout the centuries. So David referring to the golden rule. Another comment from Dennis, stealing is always wrong. However, the punishment is situational. And then another comment, if you have situational ethics, you have no ethics, because the way you color your situation would determine how you act. Our cultural ethics are based on Judeo-Christian values. Other cultures have different ethics. And then we had a comment, I hope I don't have that 2% as my agent. So that's a summary of some of the questions and comments we've had so far.
Thank you for sharing. Absolutely outstanding. For those of you that sent those back in, I'm going to speak to a couple things here really quick. The golden rule, huh? Do unto others as you want to be done unto, but what happens if your client doesn't want to be done unto the way you want to be done unto? And suddenly, and I believe I have this right, I may have the author wrong, forgive me if I do. I believe it's Dr. Tony Alessandro. I believe he's the author of the Platinum Rule. And I don't have the benefit of seeing how many of you have heard of the Platinum Rule. But fascinating, the Platinum Rule, do unto others as they want to be done unto. So I get the golden rule, believe me, I do. All right, and some people define the golden rule as the people with the gold make the rules. And that's a little spin off of it. Obviously, I don't like that as much as do unto others as you want to be done unto. But maybe the way your client wants to be done unto is not how the way you want to be done to is not how your client wants to be done unto. So Dr. Tony Alessandra comes out with a book, very thick book, I believe it, I got the author right, and one statement called the Platinum Rule, do unto others as they want to be done unto. So a while ago, I'm addressing the Wisconsin funeral directors. That's amazing, isn't it? Funeral directors have continuing ed, and they have ethical CE they have to go to. So I'm addressing them on this, and I get up and I talk a little bit about this Platinum Rule, do unto others as they want to be done unto. I think we've got the definition, and all of a sudden the funeral director raises his hand and says, well, what happens if your client's asking you to break the law? And as soon as the words go out of my mouth defining the Platinum Rule, and his response comes back to me, out goes the Platinum Rule. Correct? Interesting. Golden Rule is great standard. Hopefully some of you haven't heard of the Platinum Rule. And one more time, the Platinum Rule is do unto others as they want to be done unto. And you leave this webinar in 30 minutes saying, you know, great, never heard of it, got something out of it, and it was worth my time. Fascinating. Then another response to question number one about the punishment of situational. I agree. It's not consistent, is it? And maybe therein lies an issue right there. If you believe abiding by laws and rules is a standard of good ethics, then why is it that, and I'll speak to Wisconsin, that the speed limit on our highways, on our interstate system, for the most part is 70, and they'll let you go a little faster. There's a saying here, and by the way, if any of you ever drive in Wisconsin, I'm just quoting, I don't recommend you do this, okay? I'm just quoting, but there's sort of a saying out here, 9 is fine, 10 your mind. Well, and that's from state troopers. 9 is fine, 10 your mind. Well, let's be clear about this. Now, so the limit's 70 miles an hour on an interstate system in most areas. They're going to let you go 79, but if you go 80, now they're going to tag you, right? They're going to pull you over. Now, some of them, right, if you get pulled over, will do what? Give you a warning. Others will what? Give you a ticket. I know an officer, it's my wife's friend's husband, who is in our state, and literally says, I pull him over if I feel like it. And so, interesting stuff. So when I hear the comment coming from one of you through Brendan, which is great, is, yeah, you know, laws are laws, ethics is black and white, rules are rules, but the punishment is situational. Interesting, because now there's a little inconsistency to that, and very interesting. So the individual who spoke to situational ethics, and we color it the way we choose to, interesting, and I agree with that. So, Brendan, unless other comments have come in since I've wanted to speak to those three, because this is what it is. This is all, it's what this session's about, is all the interaction and the feedback. Unless there's other comments on it, I'm going to close out number one, but I'm going to make a statement to close it out. So is there anything that's come in since you last spoke that we should talk about?
Well, I'll summarize. We have had a lot of interesting feedback. There's a critique of the Platinum Rule, that it's really not a standard for dealing with people. It doesn't result in human betterment. The book is the Platinum Rule. Thank you for that, Daniel, written by Michael O'Connor and Tony Alessandra. So you were right there, Robin. And people today never use the word immoral. Nobody wants to be accused of being immoral. This forces them to change how they define moral. There are good morals and bad morals. Are bad morals immoral? And then one has to consider the fallout when implementing the Platinum Rule. And lastly, ethics is a changing standard based on societal changes, i.e. slavery was once legal. So that's a synopsis of all the interesting comments we've had around question number one.
Yeah, outstanding. And for the latter one, thank you. And I agree with slavery at one time being lawful. And wow, huh? Isn't that something? And so if in your definition or anyone listening's definition, you believe part of good ethics is abiding by laws and rules, and I know I said this earlier, you don't have to like the laws and you don't have to like the rules, but if you break them, obviously there could be consequences, and I say could be because obviously that goes back to the situational.
And Robin, I'm sorry, I just have to get this one in from Adam. This is priceless.
Yep.
Saying that ethics is morals are not universally standard. He was in Russia for a brief period of time, and the belief was shame on the shop owner if I am able to steal from them, not shame on me for stealing.
well, and there you have it. Very quickly, so to speak to the laws and going back to slavery just for a minute is one of the questions I would normally ask, and I want to move it forward here. But one of the questions I would normally ask is, does ethics change from generation to generation? That is one of the questions I ask in the program in a box. Does ethics change from generation to generation, or is it morals, values, and what society accepts that changes? In other words, when I would quick ask a question live, does ethics change from generation to generation, most people would yell out yes. And I said, well, is it ethics that changes from generation to generation, or is it values and morals and what society accepts that changes? And once I say that, more people are inclined to go in that direction. However, if you believe good ethics or a foundation, one of the pillars of good ethics, is abiding by laws and rules, and laws change, then ethics changes. And so outstanding dialogue, feedback coming from you through Brendan. And Brendan, I hope you can save those responses, because I'd like to see them all at the end. I'd like you to email those to me if you're able, so I can develop this even further if we do a part 2 to this. Now, allow me then to close out number 1. And I think, remember what I said, this is one that when I started about 8 or 9 months ago, after studying ethics for decades, posing questions, this is one of them that I thought, I'm not sure I can answer. But I've been drawn to a conclusion, and here's the conclusion. That I believe we, listening, author our own book of ethics, which is black and white. That I believe we are the authors of our own book on black and white. And as an example, in conclusion, I once had someone ask me, this was amazing, we had about 200 people in the room, and someone asked, Robin, do you believe you run your life black and white? And I didn't hesitate. My response is yes. And his response back to me was, do you ever speed? And my response was yes. And he goes, oh, lose your license. And you know what? He wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong. And so, interesting. So we're going to move this forward to question number 2. And it really started, this all started out with the word fiduciary. And I want to take you back, just, some of you are very familiar with this. You're as much or more in the know than I am on this, but going back one more time to 2010, when the United States Supreme Court said, we believe that word fiduciary is poorly defined. And so what I did once that came public is go around for about 6 to 7 years. Every time I had an ethics class in the United States, I would either take a flip chart if it was a smaller group, or an overhead projector where you could write on, if it was a larger group, and say, all right, in one word, in an adjective, define for me, when you hear the word fiduciary, what does it mean to you? And I had literally thousands and thousands of adjectives that came up. I've been narrowed down to 3, if you will. You may want to get these down. This is what people around the United States believed the word fiduciary to be before the DOL defined it for us. You see, I sort of took upon myself, if the United States Supreme Court can't define it, I'll find out how we as Americans define it. And here's the 3. Here are the 3 that came up. And believe me, if they came up once, they came up hundreds of times. And these are the 3 that came up the most. Again, the word fiduciary, the first definition of responsible. The second is trustworthy. And the third is on behalf of. And I'm going to repeat those. I don't have the benefit of seeing any of you, so I don't know if any of you are making notes or whatever. But the first was responsible. The second was trustworthy. And the third was on behalf of, which is more than one adjective, one word adjective, right? But on behalf of, and I look at these words, and those three that came up over and over and over again, and I would think of the latter, on behalf of, probably gets us closest to the Department of Labor's definition of best interests. June of 2016 is when they defined it. June 7th, I believe to be exact, is when they defined fiduciary as best interest. And we all know that on January 21st of 2017, when the inauguration took place, the fiduciary standard was supposed to take place, and then transferred back to April 10th, 2017, and then finally June 9th of 2017. And then it went live for about 9 months, as you all know, in June of 18, or March of 18. It sort of went away, but the word fiduciary and best interest were sort of linked together. And I remember taking this live to my ethics classes, saying, okay, let's talk about it. You see point number 2, whose definition of best interests? And Brendan, since I know you can hear me and I can get immediate response from you, verbal response, I'd like to role play with you if I may. Can I?
You sure can.
All right, thank you. So if we were live right now, Brendan, and let's say you were bringing me in to do, say, a life insurance review, life insurance fact finder. I've got now, last month was 40 years in the business for me. And so if we were doing this life insurance fact find, in the end, Brendan, you know yourself better than I do. So you probably would believe that you would know what's in your best interest. Would you agree with that statement?
I agree.
Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, if you're making notes, write that down, that the customer, the consumer, has their definition of best interest. Brendan, let me ask you this. Would you agree with me that after 4 decades in the industry, fact-finding, experience in the industry, that people that, when I ask certain questions to and they give me certain answers, that I sort of have an idea what might be in their best interest? Would you agree with me then, Brendan, after 40 years of experience, that I might know based on your responses what's in your best interest?
Yes, I would.
Okay. For those of you making notes, write that down. Agent. So right now we have 2 definitions. I'm only going to take this out 5 times, but I think you'll all get the message here. As an agent, Brendan, in almost every state, an agent represents the company. Now, there may be some states that are individuals from states that are listening that may not be the case. Generally speaking, in insurance law, a broker represents the applicant, but an agent represents the company. So if I'm an agent, Brendan, obviously I represent a company. Do you think my company has its definition of best interests?
Yes, I do.
Okay. For those of you making notes, make sure you write that down, company. So now we have the consumer's definition, the agent's definition, the company's definition. Now, I don't know where we're going with all of this yet, Brendan, but in this fact find, but let's supposing that we are going to sell you some mutual funds. I would have a broker-dealer to do that and to run them through and things like that. So let me ask you this. Do you think my broker-dealer might have its definition of best interests?
Yes, I do.
Okay. We're going to do this one more time, and I appreciate your patience on this. So now we have our 4th definition, and finally the 5th one. Sometimes agents, banks, everyone should know this listening, banks don't sell insurance. There's a company that is a bank now, a major company that is now a bank as well, but banks don't sell insurance. Banks hire licensed agents and then contract with insurance companies to sell insurance. That's generally how it works. Maybe with 50 states out there, there's an exception, but generally speaking, banks aren't in the insurance business. They hire employees, license them to sell insurance, and then contract with insurance carriers. They know that some of that money is going to walk out the door, and so they want to capture some of it in what we call fee income. Brendan, last question. Let's just say I happen to be an employee of a bank. Might my bank that I'm an employee of has its definition of best interest? Might it?
I've never thought about it, but it might.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate your role playing with me
Sure.
there. And for those of you listening, here's what I was talking about going around the country when the Department of Labor defined for us what they believe a fiduciary to be, and a fiduciary's best interest. And I said, okay, fine. Whose definition? They never define that. They define best interest. We have to be in the customer's best interest. That's how they've defined it. Whose definition? Whose definition? The customers, the agents, the companies, the broker-dealers, or the banks in this case. We could probably stretch it out further, but I'm not going to. And so everyone listening knows that when things are going well, everybody's happy. Everybody gets that. When things are going well, everybody's happy. When things don't go so well, they want to find someone to blame. And so I remember talking about this, saying, okay, fine, wait till the first lawsuit comes against that agent for operating in the client's best interests. But then, how's the court going to settle on whose definition of best interest was it? And that's where I wanted to go just with this. We probably don't have to take it any further, just a little history there. Going back to 2010, how the United States Supreme Court couldn't define it. They think it's poorly defined. Moving it forward to the Department of Labor defining it for us, best interest. I don't think there's anyone in here that disagrees. We ought to be in the customer's best interest. Shame on us if we're not. In fact, most would say that's one of the pillars of a definition of good ethics. So if there's several standards of pillars, a foundation of defining good ethics. We talked about one earlier under question number 1, is ethics black and white, abiding by laws and rules. Now we're into number 2, whose best interest, and I think most of us would agree we ought to be in the customer's best interests. But this is interesting because in some states, an agent represents the company, and yet if I'm the consumer and I don't believe you have my best interests, I'm not going to buy from you. Imagine that. An agent, by definition, in a lot of states, on this webinar, says, if you're an agent, you represent the company, but if I'm the consumer and I don't believe you as an agent has my best interest, I'm never going to buy from you. And so now you have me over on one side, you've got the company on the other, and you as the agent in the middle. Oftentimes states call you a producer, and even other states call you an intermediary. An intermediary, ladies and gentlemen, an intermediary. You are the in-between, between the consumer and the company. The commissioner's office, defining an agent representing the company, puts you smack in the middle of a potential conflict of interest, which is a latter question, which we won't get to today. But the commissioner's office in some states, the director, Commerce Department in other states, they're all called differently. They put you in that by saying an agent represents the company, but you got to have the customer's best interest. And so you all know what happened last March. So suddenly this fiduciary standard goes away, but the common best interest goes out. I just want to put this back out there to you to think about. We've only got about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to field some questions. But the amazing thing is in court, how's it going to be settled on? When finally someone takes an agent to task and saying, they weren't in my best interest. A good defense attorney ought to be saying, well, now wait a second. Whose definition of best interest? Brendan's? Mine? My company? My broker-dealer? My bank as an employer? Interesting stuff. Brendan, are there any comments that have come up on this one before I move to number 3?
Not concerning best interests. So you're on for question number 3, Robin.
All right. Here we go. What really is transparency? And I'll tell you what, let me just give you a little history of this. And for those of you listening, I'm not talking about the political arena here. Please, that's not what I'm talking about. Because you hear that word bantered a lot. But I would say in my travels around America about 3 years ago, summer of 2016, I started hearing this word a lot more, the word transparency, in our industry. And so I'm thinking, is this a word that's here today and it's going to be gone like a buzzword? Is it going to be here forever? And so, like the word fiduciary on a flip chart over an overhead projector, I started to take this around the country and say, what word comes to mind when you hear the word transparency? What word comes to mind? And I was looking for one standard, consistent adjective or couple words or phrase. I didn't get it. And what I'm trying to say is I believe a piece of good ethics is full disclosure. Begs the question, can I be honest with you but not tell you the whole truth? Okay? Can I be honest with you but not tell you the whole truth? And believe me, I can be. The generation above me, I'm talking about 80s and 90s, would say absolutely not, there's no such thing as half-truths. My generation may define honesty a little bit differently. And let me clear up what I'm saying. Can I be honest with you but not tell you the whole truth? The answer to that's yes. One of you could ask me this simple question as it relates to what we do every day. Robin, can I get my money out of my annuity? The answer to that question is yes. You asked me for a yes or no answer. I gave you an honest answer. Yes, you can. I didn't give you everything you wanted to know, but I did give you an honest answer. Question was, can I get my money out of my annuity? The answer is yes. Obviously, if you're under 59 and a half, everyone listening knows there's a 10% federal penalty. If you're in a 5th year of a 10-year surrender charge, there's going to be some issues there, and you'd want to know that. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's a big difference between honesty and full disclosure, and that's in my program in a box, and that becomes another standard of what good ethics is, full disclosure. Giving your customer everything they need to know to make an informed decision. Big difference between honesty and full disclosure. Giving, for those of you making notes, giving your customer everything they need to know to make an informed decision. Giving your customer everything they need to know to make an informed decision. And you could take it a step further. And they understand. And they understand. So, just stay with me on this now. What I was looking for in the definition of transparency. Some would say, well, it's honesty. It's forthright. It's candid. Occasionally I'd get a full disclosure. Well, okay, honesty. I can be honest with you, not tell you the whole truth. All right, forthright. All right, candid. That's an interesting word. You know what candid means to me? Because if you want you to be candid, that's the unvarnished truth. You asking me my opinion, I'm going to give it. Might hurt your feelings, but that's what candid is. And if you don't want my opinion, don't ask for it. And so these are just some words that have come up when I've gone around the country, when I've gone around America. Candid, forthright, honest. Some have said full disclosure. What I was looking for was something that was consistent over and over and over again. That when I say, is this a word that's here today and gone tomorrow, a buzzword, or is it here to stay? You know, what I was hoping is, if this was going to stay, that the word transparency replaces full disclosure. I haven't gotten there yet. I have not seen that from my studies around the country asking that question. And truth is, in my experience, and maybe not yours, but in my experience, the word transparency is not as prevalent today in my insurance circles that I run with than it was 3 years ago, which tells me now that maybe it was just a hot word then, a buzzword then for a while, and now it's going away. Perhaps to be determined yet. Perhaps 3 years isn't a long enough time for me to make that conclusion yet, but at least in the interest of our webinar, I want that to be a takeaway, that if you're hearing that word transparency, outside of the political arena, but in our industry, what does it mean? What does it really mean? What does it mean to you? Maybe you'll define it. Maybe we'll have 57, 58 different definitions of transparency. Maybe not. Maybe we'd come up, 20 of us would come up with the exact same word for it. And maybe we're on to something then. But just tuck it away and see if you're hearing it more often in your conversations. And if someone's bringing it up, ask them what that means to them. You'll come away from this with your own definition of transparency, but see if we can get something a little bit more consistent. For me now, my conclusion has been in a brief time of 3 years or thereabouts, that was a hot word then. It seems to be an inconsistent definition around America, and maybe simply a word that's going to go away, and full disclosure remains the constant as it relates to good ethics. And remember, full disclosure is giving your potential customer or your customer everything they need to know to make an informed decision, and confirming that they understand it. Brendan, I could keep going. I think it's probably okay to stop here from a standpoint of age, because that one could take a long time. But I know this is about the time you'd wanted to field any other questions that might be there, or what have you. So let me know.
Well, that sounds good. And Robin, you're welcome back to answer the rest of the questions for a part 2, if you'd be interested in doing that at some point in the future.
All right, we'll talk as soon as this is over. We'll talk.
Right. Wonderful. So we do have some other questions. One of them goes back to the issue of, well, really the black and white issue. Okay. Are you making the argument that ethical relativism is not applicable? You're making the argument for moral certainty. In the end, hurting somebody by what you sell them or do for them is unethical, no matter what they would do otherwise. We are judged by at least 12 in this country. So, interesting observations on the issue of ethical relativism.
Yeah, don't disagree with that. Don't disagree with that statement either.
Another comment, given the question, ethics would dictate that you give full disclosure. Given the question, ethics would dictate that you give full disclosure, which is true honesty.
Good ethics. Good ethics would dictate that you give full disclosure. That would be the only thing I change on that, because ethics could be bad, and unfortunately, right? So good ethics would dictate that you give full disclosure. I don't disagree with true honesty. And when we have, there would be some individuals that would just simply say, look, honest for me is full disclosure, and I get it, and I do get that. And so it comes back to, maybe we write our own book on how we define full disclosure and honesty. But I think when you say true honesty, can I get my money out of my annuity? Yes. Okay, I mean, that's truthful. It is honest. I didn't give them everything. Okay, so I still think maybe full disclosure encompasses it, but for that individual who wrote that in or made that comment, the idea of this is not to change your mind. It's just to give you maybe a different way of looking at it, and so I don't disagree with the comment there at the end of true honesty. I just think the only word I change in there is good ethics. Good ethics is full disclosure, true honesty.
We have a follow-up question, but by your situational ethics, what is good or bad? And
well, there you have it, right?
Yeah.
Think about that. There it is. How do you define that? What I might define as good, you might not. What you might define as bad, I might not. You would hope. I mean, we could do. Well, let's go back to my example, working with Brendan on a fact find and asking lots of questions. Maybe we'd all ask a different question. Maybe we'd hear the answer differently. Maybe we'd misinterpret the answer. Maybe what Brendan says to me, he says the same thing a little differently. And now all of a sudden, instead of having a consistent answer to his need, we have an inconsistent answer. Maybe. Maybe we take 58 different paths to get to the end for Brendan, and in the end, it's pretty much the same. So when I hear good and bad, the situational, it's here again, it's I don't think stealing's ever good. And then you have someone, and I heard that one comment that came in saying, well, for that person, that's 2%, I hope they're not my agent. Well, yeah, I mean, so to me, that person that wrote that in, I would probably say stealing is never right. So it all depends how we define good, bad. You would think we could all look at something and say that's bad. But it goes back to my child abuse question, which I think child abuse is bad. But, I'll say this, I don't think getting a child's attention is bad. And how do you get their attention? A little tap on the buttocks, but someone else might think that's child abuse. So, it goes back to it's good and bad is defined differently. Right and wrong defined differently, which is interesting. Black and white defined differently. Brendan, we could take that a whole nother hour. We're not. I get it, but interesting. Are there any others in the last couple of minutes we have?
Well, maybe we'll close with kind of a broad question, which is that we've heard a lot today regarding things like the golden rule, the platinum rule, terms like good and bad, and even mention of Judeo-Christian ethics from one of our questioners. So my question is there a helpful distinction between morality and ethics? Is there any distinction? Is perhaps morality a higher level than ethics, which perhaps is complying to the rules of a certain industry or association? So I'll throw that back to you, Robin.
Yeah, that's great. But where do we get our morals from? And it comes right back. I hope everyone heard that. The question is where do we get our morals from, and it's where do we get our value system from? And it really would speak to number 4 about the age thing probably, and we're not going to get into that and drill down on that one, but most would say we develop our morals and our values from our upbringing. Most would say that. Now, well, okay, and I'm trying to answer your question here, Brendan, about it because, well, here we go. Some of us had 2 loving parents. Some of us listening maybe didn't. Maybe we had 1. Maybe some of us didn't have either, and we had family members, and which would argue maybe they don't have the same vested interest as being parents, but maybe they had more if they volunteered for that duty. Some would say if we don't have that, we get it in our school system. And I said this earlier, and there are some teachers that care dearly, and there are some teachers that care less. And if we don't get it there, we get it on the street. And our values, our upbringing, and you see this, and you hear about it oftentimes, where and I'll just put myself in this example here, and it doesn't speak exactly to it, but I think you'll all listening will get where I'm going with this. If I was getting beat up on the street and I had some people have my back and stop that, I might feel a little beholding to those people for saving me from broken bones or maybe saving my life. And now because I might feel a little obligation of beholding to them, perhaps I do some things that I might not normally do or feel uncomfortable doing. And so several examples right there, Brendan, to your question of where we get that from, and it's different, right? And because it's different, we all come in with perhaps a different set of morals. Wouldn't it be great if we could leave this conversation saying, well, we all sort of have a great idea of what's right and wrong, but everyone's going to look at that differently. And so I think that ethics is the end result of our morals, good or bad.
And Robin, it seems that you're in good company with some of the comments. Good ethics would include morality and honesty. Ethics in its essence deals with the moral questions of right and wrong, and morality ethics is born from necessity. So those are all some of the late-breaking comments that we've received, and also what about applying the basics of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. Thank you for that, Daniel. So
yes.
Looks like this is about all the questions and comments we have, and also all the time we have, but I have a hunch that we'll be able to move on to some of these other questions on a future date. So I want to thank all of the participants who were able to join us today for this outstanding webinar, this outstanding high-level discussion of ethics. And I want to especially thank our presenter, Robin Mueller, LUTCF, for taking time out from his busy schedule to present today and to guide us through this discussion.
You're welcome. Thank you for attending.
Great. Thank you very much. And this concludes the webinar.
Thanks, Brendan. I'm going to give you a call shortly.
All right.